Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
Welcome to another edition of the All Out Leadership Podcast. In fact, it's episode 130. That's a lot, 130, but it's been good. We're in the story of Ahimaaz, and we're going to learn our third and final point today in this story. So Ahimaaz saw the victory of David's enemy, Absalom, being defeated. He wanted to take the news to the king. Joab said, "No, you're not the one to take today." And he was envious of someone else's assignment, manipulated and pressured his way into letting him run. He outran the other messenger, and he gets to the king, and we pick up here. Verse 28, 2 Samuel 18. So Ahimaaz called out and said to the king, "All is well." And then he bowed down with his face to the ground before the king and said, "Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against the Lord my king." Then the king said, "Is the young man Absalom asleep?" Ahimaaz answered, "When Joab sent the king's servant and me, your servant, I saw a great tumult, but I did not know what it was about." And the king said, "Turn aside and stand here." And so he turned aside and stood still. So we're going to get really two angles on this. First, there's a lot of staff over the years in any organization, especially in the church context. They'll see a great tumult. They'll see problems. They'll see, "Oh my gosh," we go, "Oh, and I got this. I got to run to the boss and tell him." And then they come to me and they'll go, "Hey, yeah." And I'll go, "So what happened?" "I don't know." "What do we need to do?" "I don't know." And when we start digging and pressing for the facts, they don't know. They just go, "We got to run to the boss because there was a great tumult." And what we see is there are certain types of people who find a sense of value and identity and worth to the organization, bringing every problem to the boss. There's a fight. I got to bring it to the boss. There's a disagreement. I better bring it to the boss. But they have no answers and they have no facts. They just feel that their job is to bring everything to the boss. But ultimately what happened was Ahimaaz lost influence and he disappears from the story of history. Even though he ran, even though he brought a message, he didn't have the facts. If you're going to be the messenger that you think it's your job to bring every tumult to the boss about everything in your organization that's going wrong, you know what? Bring the facts with it because your boss is going to press you. Your boss is going to start asking for some questions, and you better have facts, double check your facts, and get some answers, and preferably bring some solutions. I want to kind of hit this from another angle too, and that is, if you feel called to ministry and you feel called to teach, to preach, there are times that you want to run. "God, I got a word. Let me run. God, I'm going to take the message to the people." And God will say, "Not today. It's not your time. It's not your season. Not yet." And here's why. God is wanting to prepare you to have the message when you show up. And there's a lot of people who show up in ministry but truly don't have a message when they show up. And what you'll find is God often takes a long time to prepare the messenger so that when they show up, they truly have a message. Some of the most influential leaders that I've heard and been impacted by over the years were often in the backside of a desert where God was preparing them for what he prepared for them. Because it's not just what you say, it's coming from the well and the depth of that well of who God's refined you to become as a leader. And there's a difference. You can listen to somebody that when they teach, you go, "Wow, they're teaching from a depth of experience." Like they're teaching out of personal conviction. They aren't talking about walking with God. They're talking about their walk with God. Like they've walked with God. They've experienced God. And then there's the person who can preach about God and share different things about God. And there's just times in your life that God is saying, "Hey, I'm going to hold you back for a season." It's not because I'm mean. It's not because I don't see the gift and the talent that I put inside of you. It's because I want to prepare you so that when you arrive, you have a message that's a word in season. Jesus was prepared for 30 years for 3.5 years of ministry. It wasn't until 30 years of age that he showed up on the scene. That is Basically, a decade of preparation for every 1 year of ministry. And just know, the longer that God may have you in a season of preparation on the backside of a desert in what feels like a wilderness, is because God is digging deeper wells in you so that when it's time and when it's your season, you show up with a deep well and with a word to refresh others in seasons. God doesn't make a mistake if it's not your time to run with a message today. Know this, be faithful where you are, keep doing what God has given you to do, serve those that are around you today, and there'll come a day, he says, go ahead and run.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership Podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at ericlawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all-out leader.